all sorts of magic numbers. The number 18 has magical powers in Orthodox Judaism, and it's built around numbers of times you have to say a prayer, multiples of 18. You have these prayer shawls that have strings on the end, which have 18 knots in them, and they have to be pulled a certain number of times. Here's one of the amazing examples of ritualism. Okay, these numbers have magical powers in Orthodox Judaism. And you will note 365 is the number of days in the year. 248 is the number of bones that people believed were in the bodies during the Middle Ages when this evolved. And together, 613. According to the holy books, there are 613 rules for daily behaviors. 365 prohibitions every day. 248 things that have to be done every day. The preponderance of the prohibitions leading one clearly fairly depressive rabbi back when to be saying, obviously, it would have been better if none of us were born, given the fact that there were more things that we could mess up by doing. But what you see here is that she's highly ritualistic, the number of prohibitions equaling the number of days of the year, the number of ritual constraints equaling the number of bones in the body. 613 is the magic number. Okay, where did these numbers come from? Very often in religious rituals, what you find is a number has symbolic value because it's got a certain appeal for making learning easier. It is not by chance that a base 10 society came up with 10 commandments, because 10 commandments then are much easier to remember than 9 or 11. What are these about? You would say, okay, well, there's some sort of ritualistic content here. God, the number of things God doesn't want us to do each day is equal to the number of days of the year. The number of things God wants us to do is equal to the number of bones in the body. Okay, great device for remembering the rules. But here's the amazing thing. Nobody knows the rules. You look through thousands of pages of commentary stretching back centuries, and the rules aren't written down, and various rabbis have made a living arguing over what are the 365 things you aren't supposed to do each day. In other words, the numbers are more important than the content. The content is less critical than the fact that whatever they are, there's 365 things that God doesn't want you to do. And whatever they are, there's 248 that God wants you to do. The number that you are attributing to God is more important in that case than the content. Okay, classic obsessive numerology. Switching over, traditional Orthodox Islam. What you find there is very detailed rules as to what foods you can eat, what the first food is you're supposed to eat each day. There are rules as to how you enter and leave a holy place. There are rules for very ornate cleansing after relieving yourself. Very detailed rules when you are washing out your mouth, how many mouthfuls of water, which hands you wash in which sequence, the exact same thing. Exact same rules as with an OCD person after showering, explicitly written down. When a man is washing himself at the end of the cleansing, should he happen to touch his penis, he has to do the whole sequence all over again. Magic numbers thought to have powers there. 7, 10, 70 and 100 apparently have magical powers in Islam, and you have very explicit, concrete instructions about them. Muhammad himself wrote down that a man who says a prayer with clean teeth gets 70 times the brownie points as a man saying his prayers without them. Multiples of magic numbers with all of that. And probably for most of you by now, what will be the most familiar is looking at Orthodox Christianity, and you have rosaries and the counting of rosaries. You have 3 as a magic number. You have very detailed numbers of times you are supposed to say prayers. You have rules for entering and leaving churches. Even in Christian groups that are viewed as some of the least ritualistic, some of the most cerebral in some ways, you look at the Lutherans. Lutherans have set rules for prayers that are only said during even years, prayers that are only said during odd years. All of these versions of orthodoxy are absolutely shot through with rituals built around cleansing of the body, food preparation, entering and leaving of significant places, and numerology. It's the exact same list as you find with OCD. And Freud, 100 years ago, came up with this amazing quote to that regard. Freud described obsessive-compulsive disorder, OCD, quote, as an individual religiosity, and religion as a universal obsessional compulsion. He absolutely linked the two. Now, just when you're thinking that I'm standing here and I'm going to start pathologizing religious belief from sort of a medical psychiatric standpoint, the exact same conclusion has been reached by religious leaders over the centuries as well. In the 15th century, there was St. Ignatius of Loyola, and what this guy did was he wrote this long tract describing scrupulosity. Scrupulosity is not a common word in English anymore, but its opposite certainly is being unscrupulous. Being scrupulous, having scrupulosity at the time was defined as someone who was going through religious ritual for its own sake. Someone who was not thinking about the content, but was just doing the ritual. And he wrote this long tract to Catholic priests saying, watch out for people like these, people who are coming and being super devout, but you will notice they're just doing the rituals without thinking of the content. Your job is to recognize them and guide them back into actually focusing on the content. They shouldn't be doing the rituals for their own sake. There's a danger of people like that showing up. In the Talmud, in Orthodox Judaism, the exact same thing. There is a law in there that when you read the holy book of Judaism, the Torah, you are not allowed to do it by heart. You have to actually read the words because there's an injunction to think about the content. Don't do it in a rote way. And Muhammad himself in Islam wrote down that people who give prayers without thinking about the content, the prayers don't count. Even religious leaders for centuries, for millennia, have recognized the pull of religious ritual for its own sake to have to admonish religious adherents to pay attention to the content because the ritual takes on a life of its own where the numbers, the content, the ritual is more important than the actual thought behind it. Yeah, Ralph. So where am I heading with this? Obviously emphasizing the similarity of the traits and that whole business that once again have a 6-hour compulsion to wash your hands each day and have it occur in the secular context of OCD, it destroys your life. You cannot function in society, you are peripheralized, you are mentally ill. And that exact same theme, get it right in the right context, and this is protected, this is honored, this is rewarded, get it in the right setting. Now, nothing about being able to do rituals and turn them from your own private OCD into the religious setting. This is not a process for making the anxiety go away. It's very important. When people are pulling off these rituals in a religious setting, it's not to make the anxiety go away, it's to share it. It's to share it over time and space with a larger community. It's to take this nameless dread and to give it a name. And to have that name come with feeding instructions and all sorts of rules for how to please the source of the named dread at this point. It's not to make the anxiety go away, it's to make the anxiety shared. Now from this, transitioning from this notion that, okay, in the right setting, the same exact trait that can ruin your life can in fact be enveloped, rewarded, welcomed, protected in the context of religious belief, now taking it one step further. Yeah, question. Why should people in a communal sense feel better? Why should we all feel better when we do rituals, and our rituals of counting the stairs and making sure the application really went down the mailbox? Why do we feel even better when we do it in the context of a community? You are absolutely right that these are meant to foster the group shared features of religiosity and spirituality. The question then becomes, why does it work? Why do we respond to it? Why do we need shamans? And why do we respond to this ability to share these customs? Why is it the trait of 18-year-olds all over the world to try to invent a whole bunch of generationally shared rituals that lets the world know I have nothing whatsoever to do with those appalling people who embarrass me, my parents? What's that whole separation that goes in? Why is it that individuation is very often going hand in hand with, I need a community to do this individuation with? That, in a sense, is the question. And that kind of brings us to this next issue, looking at sort of a next scale of this application of this ritualism. By far, one of the weirdest stories that Franz Kafka ever wrote was The Hunger Artist. And this is a story about a person who performs starving. His performance is he comes into a town and he's locked up in a cage in the middle of town, and he performs there by starving himself. And people come and watch him starve. And initially you read this, and this sounds like one of the more bizarre parables that Kafka has come up with, until you read that during the Middle Ages there were hunger artists. There were people who performed in European cities starving themselves in a ritualistic way for people to come and watch. Suddenly we now look at a next level, the notion of performing rituals and people who are very good at it. Once again, what are religious leaders about? Mostly these days we think of them in terms of people who are empathic, people who are able to use the religious tradition they come from to make people treat each other better, to comfort people during troubled times. But back to that issue that some of the time what a religious leader is about is someone who is excellent at doing rituals. And when you look at the history of religion, not only do you have the capacity for somebody to suddenly lose themselves, to finally have these same life-destroying rituals be sanctioned and protected, you have people who could make a living performing the rituals. You can have people who are amply rewarded for doing so. Some examples. Starting off with traditional Hinduism, there is a mantra there called the Gayatri mantra, which I'm sure I'm mispronouncing, but in traditional Brahmanism, you are supposed to say this mantra 2,400,000 times in a lifetime to guarantee a good afterlife. And what happens is you have these aging captains of industry who are worried that may not have quite gotten the right number in there and are feeling the years catching up with them. And what do? You hire yourself a bunch of Brahmins to come and say the prayer 2,400,000 times for you. And you say it in appropriate multiples. There are set rules. You hire 240 of them. So each of them says 10,000, 100,000, 1,000, 10,000. Each of them says a whole lot of them, and they all say the same number, and there are rules for what sort of tent city you put up for them in your backyard and what sort of feast you throw for them. You hire people to come and do the rituals for you that get you your afterlife. Switching over to Judaism, these rules of orthodox food preparation, there's an entire job you can get built around ritualistic preparation of food. Now, there's a certain primary level of this, which is people who make a living making sure food is prepared in a kosher way, that they slaughter animals, things of that sort. But there's a whole second level, people who make a living watching the folks who prepare the food. You have rabbis who make a living sitting around in slaughterhouses and making sure the animals are slaughtered in a ritualistically appropriate way. These guys don't do anything with their own hands. Their entire job is to watch and make sure the rituals are done right so that you can produce like fat-free tofu hot dogs that would bring a smile to the lips of the patriarchs. It's done so ritualistically correctly. These guys make a living doing this. And then the version probably we are most familiar with, the American experience, you have the high school graduation, you have the opening of the new town, whatever, and what happens? The local clergyman comes out and does a convocation, says a prayer, is invited to come and do a ritual to mark this community transition. And our response here is, well, yeah, of course, that's the guy's job, and that's exactly the point. You could make a living doing these rituals, and you can do that job these days, complete with health insurance and a retirement package and a 401k and all of that. You make a living doing rituals. And when you look at the history of religion, suddenly what you see is an inevitable outcome of that. If there's somebody who's spending all his time washing his hands ritualistically for the good of the community, there's some peasant out there who's got to work by the sweat of his brow to make